Hey everyone, thank you a lot for watching this presentation on why it is important to consider negative ties in studying polarized debates. So I'd like to start this presentation by just noting my enthusiasm for the large number of talks on this conference that is about negative ties and signed networks, but just to avoid some confusion. So when we speak about negative ties in social networks, we're speaking about negative interaction between individuals. So by that, we mean expressions, for example, of disagreement or forms of direct attack from one individual to another, or expressions of confrontation, opposition. So I just listed a number of these words on the slide that are all more or less synonymous to negative interaction. And I'm using them kind of interchangeably throughout the presentation. So there are a lot of talks right now about negative interaction in social networks and social dynamics. And I'm very glad because it makes my work a little bit easier. Because in this presentation, I want to convince you that we really need to take into account conflict and negative user-to-user expressions when we study social dynamics, and particularly when we study conflicting social dynamics such as polarization. So specifically, we use Twitter as a data source. I would like to show that a signed network gives a lot more insight than what is traditionally used, namely retweet networks and mention networks that are not signed. So previous research on polarization online would typically use retweet network to represent interaction between individuals, and has been quite consistently found that basically 2 or 3 groups then form in such debates, where users of one group would often retweet each other and would barely retweet users of the other side. So we see these fragmentations. And actually, those groups then correlate to stances in the debate or political ideas. And that correlation has been so strong that often these interaction patterns have been leveraged in order to predict, for example, political leaning of individuals. But on Twitter, users don't only retweet one another, but they can also mention one another. And that raises a bit of a puzzle, because when you look at mention networks, what you find is a very different story. So in mention networks, we see kind of a cohesive whole. So there seems to be a lot of interaction between users of different stances. And that has been taken to imply that there is actually a lot of communication across political divides. But that raises the question of, what do these mention mean? What is the nature of them? How should we interpret a mention? So what we suspect, also based on more qualitative research on Twitter, is that mentions are rarely a positive interaction or a form of neutral information flow, but instead mentions are often used to attack another user, or to express sort of an out-group derogation to increase in-group solidarity. So for example, the Gouden Eeuw is basically a group of users that is mentioned here and called terrorists. So that's an example of out-group derogation. Or here, Nadia Bourras is called directly a crybaby, so directly attacked. And so what we hypothesize in this research is that if you don't take into account the signs of this interaction, you're basically leaving out systematically negative interaction. Or if you use retweet networks, you're also leaving out systematically negative ties from your network analysis. And that has significant consequences. So the way we researched that is by picking a case study. So we picked a case study on the debate on Black Peat in the Netherlands. So Black Peat is basically a tradition that is held very dear by the Dutch society, where you have kind of a St. Nicholas figure with a lot of helpers on his side. And these are usually white people that dress up and put blackface on their faces. And the Dutch society found it really hard to see the racist connotations of that. And there has been a heated debate over it. And a large part of that debate also took shape on Twitter. So we used Twitter data, unquoted retweeted mentions. And what we then did is when we looked into the tweet text in order to classify user stance in this debate. So are they pro Black Peat, anti Black Peat, or neutral, or is it just too ambiguous for us to classify their stance? Then we also classified the user-to-user interaction. So of each mention, we classified whether this mention was used positively, so to endorse the other user, negatively by attack, or neutral, or was it too ambiguous for us to label. And then we used that data to create signed network. And then we did a signed analysis, and we compare that to the retweet and a mention analysis. So just shortly, to classify user stance and to classify the sign of interaction, as I mentioned, we looked into the full tweet text. So we didn't use the interaction network as an indicator, but we really looked into the text. So we manually labeled about 10,000 tweets. Then we pre-processed the other tweets and we created some features. For example, was the mention taking place in the beginning, the body, or the end of the tweet. And then we use a fast text algorithm, some machine learning algorithm, to classify the rest of the data. And we used also some pre-trained word embeddings, both from Wikipedia corpus, but also from a specific Twitter corpus that we trained it on. And by that, we were able to classify most of the mentions in their sign. And then we used quite a simple majority rule in order to classify then user-to-user interaction. So if one user would be more often negatively referencing another user, that would be a negative tie. And if a user would be more positively referencing another user, it would be a positive tie. And here we also take retweets as a positive tie between users. So we find that 75%, so the large majority of the interaction in this network is positive. Roughly 12% is negative, clearly negative. And 14% is ambiguous. We found it too hard to label whether this was meant positively or negatively. I would like to note that we are leaving out then the ambiguous user-to-user interactions, but most of these are actually based on one interaction only between users. So we don't think that that will influence the robustness of our results. And also, I like to note that in this whole method, we are actually quite inclusive. So we don't really only study the most active, loud Twitter users by, for example, only selecting the active Twitterers, but we basically also sampled for the machine learning, for the manual labeling, we sampled from the entire corpus. So also users that just tweet once. And below I show the confusion matrix to show that the classifier for predicting the sign of the mention did pretty well. Right, now we have compared a retweet analysis with a mention analysis or a signed analysis. So first, if we look at the retweet network or retweet analysis, what we basically find is a story of fragmentation and isolation. So if we group users by their stance, so anti versus pro, we see there is a lot of positive communication within these groups and barely any communication between them. Also, when you look at the community structure in the network, you find the same findings. It's consistent with previous findings. But then if you look at the mention, the story of mentions, we see a completely different picture. So if you group again by the stance, we see actually quite a lot of communication is taking place between stances. About 40% of the communication is across the divide. And if you look at the network structure, it's the same story. There's basically no community structure here. So this is a bit puzzling, but if you then bring in the sign of ties, this puzzle is resolved, because what we find is that the communication that happens between sides, between anti and pro users, is mostly negative, is mostly attacks and outgroup derogation. About 85% of it is negative. And the same if you look at the community structure. Here I colored the ties based on the sign. So negative ties are red and positive ties are green, which you see a little less because they are within the groups. So the sign network is basically showing that polarization in this debate features a lot of confrontation. So it's not just isolation and fragmentation between groups. There are direct negative expressions from group to group. Now, the sign ties give a lot more opportunities also for different research angles. So for example, one of the things you can already notice when you just look at this graph is there are some users that are very often attacked from one group, but they are barely positively referenced by their maybe in-group. So these are a bit like maybe like a scapegoat type of user that is not representative according to their in-group for their stance, but symbolically attacked by the other group a lot. So this gives an entry to like different roles in the debate. And here we can go much further than in an unsigned analysis, where we basically are with roles a bit limited to, for example, hubs of local communities or bridges between communities. But we can identify a much broader variety of roles. So here we present a simple scheme for identifying different roles. So if you draw this matrix of the way users are referenced by pro-users or anti-users, we can find, for example, group leaders. So these are figures that are often referenced by their in-group and often negatively referenced by the out-group. But we also find these type of scapegoats that are positively or barely positively referenced from their in-group, but often negatively referenced from the out-group. And we also identify possible mediators that are both by both groups positively referenced or negatively referenced. Then when we look at the data for that, we can identify these figures in this specific debate. And we find, for example, as negative mediators, the police or the prime minister. And here we could wonder, yeah, to what extent these figures could actually function as mediating between the groups. Another thing we can do with the signed ties is to look at the differences between the behavior of the pro side and the anti side in this debate. So what we find is that their interaction patterns are quite different from one another. So the main point here is that we found that pro users are a lot more confrontational, so the pro more conservative side of this debate. Attacks more often the other side. So about 33% of the users have a negative tie, whereas for the other side, it's only 18%. And of those that are attacking the other side, they are attacking like 3 times more often. And also relative to the amount of referencing that they do. So let's say their negative interaction rate is also much higher, twice as high. And so as a result, we see that a lot of there are a lot of anti-users that are quite highly attacked. So I would like to conclude the main findings then from this research. And they are both substantive, so they are about polarization and how we can see polarization, but also methodological, of course. But the first finding is that communication across divides is often negative in nature. So these are attacks, forms of outgroup derogation. And by that, we resolve some puzzles of unsigned networks, specifically between the mention and the retweet network. And these unsigned ties then give us insight into a much broader variety of roles in the debate beyond hubs and bridges. And also it allows us to look at asymmetries between sides. So we found that pro-conservative users are much more confrontational, which seems to be a bit in line with other research right now that is happening on YouTube commenting behavior or commenting behavior on Facebook groups across the political spectrum. And I think the main takeaway is that when we look at polarization, it is also driven by conflict, and polarization is not simply a matter of fragmentation and isolation. So we need, therefore, signed network analysis. And I just want to end by shortly mentioning just a very silly example, but maybe the population is divided by whether they do or don't like coriander. So some people really hate coriander, right? But that does not necessarily mean that we are polarized on coriander. So polarization really means also there is conflict between sides, and we show that this is happening online as well. Thank you very much for your attention. Please reach out with suggestions and questions, and scan the QR code to see some preprints. Thank you.